A presentation of the Public Affairs and Special Events Department of KLRB News.
This is Dialogue Assassination with research specialist Mae Brussell. For KLRB, I'm Gloria Barron. All right, Mae, one thing I wanted to ask you about 2 months ago, isn't it? Yeah, September 20th, John Smith was killed in San Jose. And I was wondering if you could bring us up to date on that particular slaying.
Oh, yes, I'd be glad to do that. When we went on the air, Gloria, the week of that death, that murder in September, I mentioned it to show my listeners how I collect articles or smell a situation out on a murder or assassination, political assassination, or how I learned to study murders after I studied the political assassinations. And if there was no conspiracy or particular crime involvement, intentional crime, you pass these things off as being either self-defense or different kind of circumstances than a political intonation or meaning to it. But Monday, September the 20th, a gentleman named John Smith Jr., who works for the IBM company in San Jose, was coming home at 4:45 in the morning, and he was pulling up to his apartment. He had passed a traffic light, supposedly, and then pulled up to his apartment, and there was an officer behind him, and the officer wanted to give him a ticket, and two plainclothesmen officers pulled up. I suppose they weren't in uniform. It was 4:45, and asked Officer Woolley, "Do you need help with this ticket?" And he said no, he was all right. And the officer parked their car, the other men parked their car anyway, and they began to help Officer Woolley in a confrontation with John Smith, the chemist, research worker from IBM, and John Smith was shot and killed. And the thing that caught my attention was that the plainclothes men were told that they weren't needed, but they parked their car anyway, and it was 3 against 1 in the back of a residential area on a traffic citation. This was Monday, and then Tuesday, the chief of police, Murphy, in San Jose, made the statement that his officer did the proper thing in killing Mr. Smith because it was self-defense and that Mr. Smith was running towards his apartment and they thought he might get a weapon and therefore he was shot. But I noticed that he was shot in the chest, and you can't, if you're running away, you'd be shot in the back. And I was very curious to know why the chief of police would defend 3 men ganging up upon 1 man at 4:45 in the morning. And other people were beginning to wonder about that too. And we made a show about that where I called attention to watch what is happening in San Jose, because the problem in our society with regard to law officers is no different than Ramsey Clark getting on the air and television one day after Martin Luther King was killed and saying it was a lone man and no conspiracy. This was the Attorney General of the United States. You see how my mind works, Gloria? And I know that these people, to come out and tell you a thing without going into the evidence means you have to go into the evidence. Because the Sunday after the murder of Martin Luther King, Ramsey Clark was on Meet the Press, and he made the remark, "We have the assassin on the run." And they said, "Well, you don't even have a suspect. Who is running? Is it 1 man? Is it 10 men? How do you know?" And Meet the Press posed the question. Ramsey Clark really couldn't answer it in a way that satisfied my mind. So you realize that when you're studying the overthrow of governments or local communities or states, there are what we call cover stories that we've gone over on the show many times. And to define it for people who haven't heard, a cover story is the front page item that you're supposed to believe that has no basis in fact. If the chief of police in San Jose wants to say, "We will investigate this murder. This citizen was an honor student. He went through on scholarships. He was a brilliant boy. He had worked his way up through the system. And He was black. I didn't know that the first 2 days, and then there was a picture of him in the paper. If the chief of police had said, this is a terrible thing, that a man was killed on our streets over a thing like this, I'll investigate it. But he didn't. He covered it. Now, that was September the 20th. What's happened since? On November the 4th, month and a half later, chief of police has been reprimanded by the city council. Officer Woolley has been charged with murder, with manslaughter. 2 days after the killing, Assemblyman up in Sacramento, Donnelly and Alquist, said we have to get into this. A citizens committee was formed. I made many, many phone calls to Sacramento, to San Jose. I called the district attorney's office up there. And I said, I'm interested in this particular murder. As the 4 or 5 days went on, they had used mace in this gentleman's eyes, and they let dogs out to chase a police dog, and the circumstances were just terrible. He was lying on the ground screaming for help when these 3 men were after him, and since that time the autopsy shows that he was beaten up and bruised. I made many calls to San Jose, and I said, I want to come up to your police department. They said, don't you think we can handle this ourselves? And I said, no. I said, if the Attorney General of the state of California is a defendant in a charge that he's covered up the conspiracy of murdering Robert Kennedy, and if he was a district attorney in Los Angeles at the time Robert Kennedy was killed, and I offered to come down and give them information that he would not accept, how can you, at your level, tell us that you can handle it when on a larger level it's covered up? If the Attorney General of the United States covers up evidence, why can't the Attorney General or District Attorney of San Jose? Now, what has happened is that one officer has been charged with murder, another has been suspended, and the third one is still walking around. But a very unusual thing happened this week, which involves the citizens of the United States, individuals, was that a gag rule was imposed. And the aftermath of all this work is this fact that the Officer Woolley, who killed John Smith, was charged with 6 illegal acts. For one thing, he had murdered, and the second thing was he was carrying illegal mace. But they have a news gag now that you can't know the 4 other things that he did that were illegal. And the other officer that has been discharged from the staff now is charged with 3 illegal acts against John Smith. Now, there's been a gag rule, which I'm going to work very hard in the next week or 2 of the Citizens Committee to break, because this silence that happens in your country, like in the national security interest, in quotes, you can't see the archives and the evidence on John Kennedy. When you allow these kind of lies to be the law of the land, then at your local level, the gag rule is put on people, and they say, we're charging a man with murder, but we won't tell you what he did. Now, reverse the situation that a man has committed a crime in San Jose, and he is a radical or an ordinary citizen who went berserk. They would tell you all 6 things he did for which he was arrested. And I am going to say now that no human being is any different than any other person. A policeman charged is no different than a grocery clerk or a student. And every person is equal under the law, and if they committed illegal acts, they should print it so that everybody knows that policemen are human and they committed these acts, and then other policemen will know that they will not be protected if they commit illegal acts. So when you let people get away with what they did in killing a president and in killing a senator or a candidate for president, and I keep saying candidate because it's an election year, and this is a heavy time, it permeates the local level, and the secrecy that you have allowed your lives to take over, you're going to feel now. Now, with the Chipka thing, everybody got excited last week. Everybody was sending in petitions and wiring and calling the White House. And I looked at the emotionalism because you were concerned about a tidal wave on the coast. You were concerned about the fish or the sea otters, and I'm not putting down those things. But when there's a national tidal wave, when I go on every week to talk about a national tidal wave that is swallowing the nation up, I don't get the same emotional response. Even around here at the station or anywhere, everyone gets excited when they think there's going to be a tidal wave on the coast of California or in Japan Why wouldn't they see what happened in Washington in 1963 on November the 22nd? That was the biggest tidal wave of all, and nobody's screaming and yelling. Do you think we can get a little motion someday about that, Gloria?
Well, we can always keep hoping.
I mean, all these petitions and all these names, and I'm throwing out facts and information every week, and some people still want to think that the assassination is a special compartment, that this is either Mae's thing or Jim Garrison's thing. This isn't my thing. That when the oil spills outside of San Francisco, you can get more people in San Francisco wiping off seagulls than you can get riding to Washington to open the archives and find out who killed John Kennedy.
Well, don't you think, Mae, that many of the people don't believe that what happened in '63 applies to what is happening today? This is the response I've had.
Well, I think that people somewhat believe it, but they have the feeling that you can't fight it. There's this general apathy. And I think that I could cite 12 instances in the news in the last 2 days where people have been able to fight back, to use the legal system to fight back. Just this morning in the paper, there was an incident in Sand City where a gentleman had a trial that moved past 2 courts and went up to San Jose, Brady Avery, where he said that he was being run off the street because they wanted to get the blacks out of Sand City, and he took it to the court. And there was nobody. The blacks in Seaside who work within the system were embarrassed by Brady because he was bringing up issues they don't want to think exist. So they ignored him. And Brady walked into the Peace and Freedom office one day and said, "What'll I do? The mayor of this little town is running me off the street, and so is his appointed a policeman, and I have a shop where I want to earn my living fixing cars, and I don't have a chance." Well, today he won a suit of $42,000. And if he won that suit, it was because 12 or 14 people believed in him. And when he took it to a jury and a judge, within the system, he won his case. But I could name 14 people that believed in Brady Avery for over 2 years. And today he won. Let's get to something lighter, Gloria.
This is clever.
Last week we talked about the sex life of the Kennedys.
Right. And this week you're going to talk about what?
The lavatory habit of President Nixon. Is that okay on the air? As long as I refer to it as the lavatory habit?
Right.
Okay. I'm just going to call attention to a little article that was in the San Jose Mercury last Sunday. There's a magazine section of question and answers that is very good. They're relevant questions and very pertinent answers, somewhat serious usually, but there was a question in Sunday's paper that I just have to take for the lighter side. Question: I've been told that in his lavatory, President Nixon has a special telephone direct to Dick Helms, head of the CIA. Can you verify it? Answer: President Nixon has a phone in his lavatory which can be connected to anyone he chooses to reach. The reason I get that out, Gloria, is that it brings fond memories to me because it flashes back to the very first political phone call I ever made in my life, and it was in 1960 from Beverly Hills, California to Drew Pearson, and it involved Richard Nixon going to the lavatory. And it was the day of the election when he was running against John Kennedy. And the circumstances in the newspaper were very weird. It was my first sleuthing, but he had gone to vote with Pat and the kids in Whittier at his old home site, and he left Pat, and I saved the articles because she didn't seem to know where he was, but they split in separate cars, and then he began his trip down to Tijuana. And the newspaper had, again, what we referred to earlier as a cover story. He gave 20 pencils to this garage attendant. He had a chocolate soda at La Jolla. It had a very detailed thing about what he did, and it seems that where he went, and nobody could find him, was down to Tijuana to have lunch with the mayor of Tijuana, and then he went into the lavatory, and they called attention to this in the paper, and did his thing, and came out and came back for the long ride up to the Ambassador Hotel, where he met his family and received the bad news that he wasn't the President of the United States. Now, I had the feeling that Richard somehow knew that he might lose that evening. He had a 50-50 chance of losing, and if he lost, it would be because of the pressure of the China lobby and the group that were interested in the Quemoy debates and intensifying the interest in Asia over our domestic problems in the United States, intensifying a Cold War and so forth. And I felt that if anybody knew who he was meeting with down there in that particular room, it would change the course of history in some way. Now, you can't say that 1,000 days later or so that history was changed and had anything to do with that particular meeting, but I felt that it was important that he ran down the way he did and met and came right back. And Drew Pearson wrote me several letters on this subject and was unable to verify who he had seen except for the mayor in Tijuana.
I wonder, my question is, why the mayor of Tijuana and why Election Day?
Well, the whole article was written in such a mysterious tone that I just called to see just what is going on. Now, today's news had an article on the My Lai charges again, and we've mentioned this before. Colonel Orrin Henderson is being charged with covering up the conspiracy in the My Lai massacre. And I want to make a suggestion to the people who listen, because you say, what can we do to effect new laws and new changes? And there are new changes being made. There were a lot of things in the news in the last 2 weeks that are good, in spite of the overwhelming tightness of control and bad. And I do think that it is very important to make in your heads the idea that someday any congressman who receives information of a conspiracy to murder the president or the candidate or public officials who does not investigate that conspiracy should be subject to the same charges that Mr. Henderson is being charged with today. You see, he's going before a military panel for failure to investigate the slaying of civilians at My Lai and failure to report to superiors on the incident. Now, a third charge that he was charged with, which has been dropped, was making a false official statement during the pre-trial investigation. I suggest that you write to your public officials, which I'm going to be doing in the next 2 weeks, writing to every member of the Congress like I have from time to time, and to say, you, Mr. Fulbright, or you, Mr. Irvin, or Mr. Kennedy, or anybody who receives information, or Representative Talcott, if you receive information from some person who is a serious researcher who has a legal case against the National Archives, against particular people involved in these assassinations, if you fail to investigate these assassinations, if you fail to report them to your superior, like the Justice Department, if you make false statements that there was no conspiracy or that you have investigated when you haven't, then you should be charged with murder or conspiracy to murder if the truth does come out under another administration. That you should be charged with murder on the same way that this particular man is being charged. Because the men in Congress have much information about the conspiracy of these murders and how this country is run, and they pretend they don't know. And by pretending they don't know, we get in worse shape every day. So I think that the time will come that some law is going to have to be made, starting at a local level and moving up to the state level and the national level, that if you have evidence of these crimes and you cover them, you are charged for the crime the same as if you committed it. The people on up can't conceal these any longer. I don't think it's fair. Now, Lyndon Johnson, did you see the picture of him in the paper last night in the Herald? He was plugging his book. LBJ was plugging his book, and he's holding it up, The Vantage Point. Well, it should be The Vantage Point, because he took all the documents away, the secret documents, and he's got them down in Texas, so we can't see it from where he sees it. Lyndon Johnson was plugging his book. This is what he said, in quotes: "Buy a book and give it to the generations to come and let them know how good the blessings of the good Lord were to us in the 1960s, end quote. Well, they were pretty good to him because he wasn't charged with murder, and he isn't under arrest, and he's still alive, and the Lord's been pretty good to him so far. But I also thought of all the people around Lyndon Johnson that the Lord's been good to in 1960. His friend Ross Perot down there in Texas just made $1 billion in 5 years doing the computer work for Medicare. That was written up in Ramparts. If we have time, we'll talk about that in a little while. But Ross Perot is the fellow who flies the goodies to the prisoners of war at Christmas to tear your hearts out, and returns with the plane and the unopened gifts. And in between 51 weeks during the year, otherwise, he has accumulated $1 billion doing the data processing for Medicare and Medi-Cal that Lyndon Johnson put in for the Good Society. So if you want to read Ramparts this month, it has a very large article on how Ross Perot made his money it's been a good 1960. And LBJ didn't lose much either. He was supposed to.
He did all right.
Many, many, many millions. It's rumored at 17 million. And Lady Bird Johnson, who is a large stockholder in Brown and Root, the Texas firm that does the construction for Vietnam, including the tiger cages and much more, did very well in the 1960s. One of the men who was working for Brown and Root at the time of the assassination was George de Mohrenschildt, Lee Oswald's closest friend. Leon Jaworski, who's now president of the American Bar Association, was Lyndon Johnson's very, very close friend and on the board of directors of the CIA Foundation. I want to go into that in a lot of detail. He did well, and so did the Republic National Bank that Jack Anderson talked about this week that gets fixed $56 million in federal deposits in Dallas alone and pays no interest, but then puts the money out to you and charges you interest. They take the money out of your savings, and it's deposited in several banks across the country. It was written up in a lot of detail this last week. The Republic National Bank in Dallas has $56 million of your money sitting there. So they did well in 1960, and so did General Dynamics in Fort Worth, making contracts for the F-111 and other Air Force industries, and John Conley did well in the 1960s. He's become the Secretary of Treasury and no doubt will become the Vice President and the President of your United States. And George Bush from Texas is the head of the UN. So Lyndon might say that the good Lord was good to them in the 1960s. He went on to say something else in pushing his book. He said not a cent of the money from this book is going into his pocket. He was paid $1.6 million for the book. We gave it to the library and the school. This book was written so the young people of the future would be better prepared to bring peace in the world, and all the decisions that are in this book are backed up by the 31 million documents in this library. I believe I knew what I was doing better than someone else would know what I was doing. I venture to say, Gloria, that the money that goes from the sale of the book will pay the guards to keep part of those 31 million documents locked up. Some of them we're not going to see, like in the National Archives in Washington. You can't see for 75 years because Lyndon Johnson ordered it. He also has top-secret documents down there in Texas. If Lyndon really wanted us to study peace and war, there wouldn't be any top-secret documents at all. But it'll take all the money that he's got from this book to guard the documents. It's going to take more guards than that because someday there's Ellsbergs coming out of the woods. Now, did you read that the CIA is intensifying its United States...
domestic, isn't it?
The domestic spy shakeup, yes. The overall rule in the United States is going to intensify. This came out since we met last week. It was in Saturday's news that the White House announced that Richard Nixon has ordered an overhaul of the government's intelligence operations, and Richard Helms will be given an overall supervisory role. It's going to do the community-wide responsibility in the United States. Now, it's very important that they reorganize the CIA in the United States. They're going to make a net assessment within the National Security Council. You see, there's people like Daniel Ellsberg, who had access to documents, who are telling the people, this is a state of emergency, you have to be told the truth. There is Louis Tackwood in Los Angeles talking about the police department committing some very heavy crimes and murders, and he had to know more than... He hasn't mentioned the Bobby Kennedy case, but he's on the periphery of all the other murders in California. And he would have to be hunted and charged with treason if he got his hands on those documents. You see, a lot of people are not afraid of the treason charge. They're going to speak up. But Richard Nixon has to consolidate what is going on in the United States. The article went on to say it will reconstitute the U.S. Intelligence Board and set up priorities for gathering national intelligence and supervising its dissemination and protecting the security of intelligence, material, sources, and methods. You see, they have to find out who is taking the stuff or who has the information and protect themselves against this information coming out to the people, because everything...
That word protect bothers me.
Protect themselves?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you see, crimes were committed, and there is evidence to prove that crimes were committed. And what the paranoid people feel who were part of this crime is that if we lock up all this material, no one will know if we control the courts and the justice of the Supreme Court, no one will know. But some people might even risk their life and leave the country and have hold of one document that would overthrow the people that are in power today. And they have to tighten up who everybody is seeing or talking to or sources of information and get ready with heavy charges of treason.
Well, that's awfully Big Brother, isn't it?
Well, we're here. Mm-hmm. We're here. I got information from an ex-law enforcement man in Los Angeles last week on just how Big Brother we are. And if I were stopped for a traffic citation, the officer can sit in his car and give my name, and while he's writing the ticket, within like 7 seconds, my entire political profile is given back to him. And then they just say, well, who are you with? What are you doing? Where are you going? Who are these people? Just to fill in a progress report on what you're doing. They have everyone in the state of California, I'm sure almost everyone in the United States, within 7 seconds, they go back to their car now. They don't stand by your window.
I think very few people are aware that there are dossiers on just about everybody.
Everyone. The CII in California is like the national CIA, and it goes all over the United States. So that, in the old days, you went through a light or you're going too fast, you got a ticket, and the friendly cop stood up by the side of your car, and he talked and he wrote his thing. He goes back to his car and sits there for about 5 minutes. I asked, can I get out of my car and go back and listen? I asked this particular gentleman and hear what he's saying. And he said, well, yeah, but things then come back in code, and everything has a code. And but they go to their car and they call in, and they get the rundown of everything you're doing and where your head is at. I mentioned this to somebody the other day, and they said, well, I was stopped, and this happened. And they called in and got all kinds of data. So next time somebody wants to give you a ticket, get out of your car and go sit with him while he writes it and get an education in what's happening in California.
Take down a lot of numbers.
Yeah.
Because it would be in code, right?
It would be in code. Well, just get the lingo to see what is happening. You see, now last week in our local community on Tuesday night, there was a meeting at Monterey Peninsula College for the Monterey County Soledad Committee, where they invite ex-convicts and local people, families of convicts in Soledad now to talk about problems that are going on in that prison because it's close to our local community. And you wonder, well, how does this fit in with dialogue assassination or political assassinations? But I'm going to tell you something that happened at the meeting, and I was hoping this particular person could be here today, but he couldn't, and I'm going to briefly mention it, and then I'll have him down as a guest.
Oh, that would be very nice.
But at the meeting, Terry Mangan was there talking about radicals in the area. He had just come back from Washington and testified about radicals in the Fort Ord area that try to influence the soldiers. And there were a lot of policemen and law enforcement officers from the peninsula at this particular meeting. And at the meeting was a young gentleman who'd been with the sheriff's department in Los Angeles County. And he was trying to explain how within the police department evidence is planted, that they have foreknowledge of murders, that the police department, sheriff's department are guilty of committing crimes. And this is what I've been saying on the show all along. But based upon my research, I know this is true. So, of course, the police gentlemen were very defensive. This doesn't happen, it doesn't happen, it couldn't be. And even though it may not happen at a local level, the point is that it does happen at a national level. We're not sure what happens at a local level. If you don't point out the problem, you can't cure it. So in the course of the conversation, the gentleman who was a guest there, who come down from San Francisco, said, "You're not going to believe the story I'm telling you." He said, "It's a very heavy thing, and it has to do with the Manson case."
Okay, well, we'll stop right now before you get on with that, Mae, and make a station break. You're listening to Dialogue Assassination with Mae Brussell. This is KLRB Stereo FM, Carmel by the Sea.
Right. Now, this particular gentleman began to talk about the Manson arrest in Los Angeles at Topanga Canyon at the Spahn Ranch, where he was in on the arrest of Charlie Manson. And about 3 weeks ago, Gloria, we made a tape here on just the Sharon Tate massacre. You remember that?
Right.
And it was a landmark case, I think, in news affairs, in news break, because nobody had publicly stated until that date that the Sharon Tate killings were a political massacre. And I had studied them for 2 years. And whenever I talk about the killing of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, I throw in the La Bianca, Sharon Tate, J. Sebring, Folger, the whole massacre of the 7 people as being a political thing for the reason that it was done to come down on a class of society called hippie. That the hippie was no different than chasing the black, which had been going on for years, and coming down on them. And that the purpose was to discredit this group across the country and to effect an election which was to take place in our state, to effect pressures for law and order, and to come down, mistrust these young people, don't give them rides, don't house them, and disassociate yourself. They're violent. And I saved the evidence of Charlie Manson and who he was seeing, or the lawyers he and Charles Watson were seeing. And Manson, to me, was a political patsy. He did not kill the people in those 2 homes that evening. He may have murdered other people. I have no evidence of earlier murders, but I know he didn't do those. And he was no different than Oswald or Ray or Sirhan in terms of being a patsy for a purpose. The 1-hour show, I hope, can you redo it someday?
Yes, I think we should.
If there's no earth-shattering news, maybe next week in place of this broadcast, could you redo the Manson one?
Yeah, I'll have to dig out the tape, yeah.
Because it's very, very important to the local news that we talk about all the time. Well, this particular gentleman that spoke to the community meeting, that saw that community meeting, mentioned that the Sheriff's Department in Los Angeles had full knowledge of Charles Manson weeks prior to the killings, and that local people were complaining that they had machine guns, that they were making a lot of noise, and that they were shooting and military type of practicing out there, and they wanted them arrested, and there was every reason to arrest Charlie Manson and the group of people that were at his ranch, 30 or 40 people. He was out on parole. He had been charged with slavery. Earlier, he had a girl who was underage. The father dropped the arrest charge, but he was on parole, so the sheriff could have kept Manson in because he had a minor with him. They knew they had all kinds of heavy drugs, narcotics, and so forth. They had machine guns and weapons, and he was on parole. And every time a sheriff made a report on Manson or a memo, the order came out, you don't touch Manson. This was for weeks before the Sharon Tate murder. You don't touch Manson. And they were not allowed to make an arrest. They said, well, why don't we go in here? Here's this guy's at Spawn Ranch. And they had an obligation to the citizens in the area who said there's an outlaw motorcycle gang, violent people, weapons going around. And the police department, the sheriff's department, would not touch him. And the citizens were subjected to whatever terror would come down on them. They didn't know what was happening. And the memo said, you don't touch Manson. But some stolen car parts were missing a week after the Sharon Tate murder, and they brought in Manson and all the girls and Watson into jail for 3 days. And they let them out. This was after the murder. And they could have had him then on all these other charges, on the narcotics, the slavery, and they took machine guns away in this arrest. It took 2 helicopters. The gentleman gave the account that 1 week after the killings, we made a raid. He said at Spawn Ranch on a Saturday morning. They made a dawn raid. And they hit it with 102 deputies, and all the regular deputies were out except a very few. And they had 2 helicopters, 30 radio cars, everything they could muster. They came up with 13 weapons, 2 of which were automatic, handguns, machine guns, and so forth. But they let Charlie go, and he went out to the Barker Ranch and disappeared because the people in the neighborhood were having a fuss, and he went out. And he said just the logistics of moving 30 or 40 people out to the Barker Ranch, where they had all their facilities and they were taken care of. And they were not picked up by the Los Angeles Police Department at all. It was, again, on stealing a car part or something. Now, what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that the legal departments in the city of Los Angeles, California, were waiting for Charlie Manson to kill. Now, the particular man who worked in the department said he thought that they had foreknowledge of their intelligence gathering. They had intelligence report all the time, every day, coming on Charlie Manson. He was to kill black people, Black Panthers. And then the L.A. Police Department would look clean because they'd find the killer and the Panthers would be wiped out. So the law enforcement people did not protect blacks, if this was what it was to be. Now, this particular man was completely stupefied because he only knew what was happening, how you would arrest a man and they let him go, or how they wanted to arrest him and they wouldn't let him. And I said that because I followed the overthrow of Greece and the way they came down on the hippies and in 1967, and then Kaiser putting out his report on hippies done by non-hippies in this area and saying they were violent, that I was waiting for something to come down on that class of people. And that what I knew was that Manson was allowed to happen. He was allowed to happen. So my research into political assassinations goes very deep, and it covers many years. And it continues every day. And then when you go to a meeting, not expecting to hear anything like this, but to hear problems about your local area and solve that, and a man comes and says, "You won't believe this story," it just really blew my mind. And of course, the police officials right away were going to put this man down. This isn't true. It doesn't happen. I said, "Now wait a minute. I've done this research," and out of the woods came this person he didn't even know existed. He didn't know anyone in the United States was doing any research into the Sharon Tate murders as being a political thing. And then he disclosed that the Special Enforcement Bureau of the Sheriff's Department, the same group, the political branch of that group, was the one that went up to Santa Barbara, held with Isla Vista, that clubbed the kids, that did the real hurting, that made the scene, that made the headlines, the agent provocateurs, the smell of the students, the radicals, the blood. That branch, not the Santa Barbara police. The Santa Barbara police get a bad name. The students get a bad name. The state gets a bad name. The Special Enforcement Bureau was the group that went right up to Isla Vista. So there are political branches of the law enforcement agencies, and these things have to be cleared out. This is where the conspiracy lies. If you say you talk every week about conspiracies, name places. I'm telling you that every branch of every law enforcement agency has its own tax squad, special squad, conspiracy group, and when these murders come down, they handle the investigation, they collect the evidence, they plant the evidence. They are the group, like in Los Angeles that Louis Tackwood talked about. They are the special branches that take care of all the conspiracies and the provocateurs. Now, yesterday, Gloria, I found in the Mercury, San Jose Mercury, an article which is so pertinent that I'm going to use the remaining time of this show to talk about it.
Yes, I read that one yesterday.
Did you read it?
Yes.
This is supposed to be the swan song of the ego of American youth, the finale to John Kennedy. And I might say, as I talk about the article, that one suggestion to make is that if the young people would get some of the records of John Kennedy, which should be in the library or buy them at the record stores. I own some of his speeches because that name is gone for these people who don't remember who he was. We're studying political assassinations, and these young people have lost their ego and their hope. If they would get these records and listen to what John Kennedy said and his voice and the content of his material, and then play a speech of Richard Nixon, alongside of it, his recent speeches or the records, if there are, of Richard Nixon's speeches, then you would know what was lost in the last 8 years. The only way you know what you lost is if you see the difference. If you go to New Woolworths and you buy a diamond ring and you're down building a sandcastle and it falls off, you won't miss it unless you've had a ring from Tiffany. I'm not saying John Kennedy was Tiffany, but you have to get an authentic feeling of somebody trying to effect changes in society and the sincerity or the program that intended to be put into effect that barely got started. And you have to know what you lost to make a comparison. But the New York Times came out with an article, unsigned, of course. I would love to know who wrote it, called Youth's Great Ego Trip is Fading Out. Now, if there was one thing we can't afford to lose in any time or any place or any hour of our day, it's our ego. When that's gone, you are in great trouble. And I'm going to read part of the article, and I'm going to make remarks about it as we go along. And I want to explain what they're trying to say. The gist of the article is that the hopes of the kids in the 60s and the excitement is over. Who are your heroes? Who do you admire? There aren't any. You can't find individuals with heroes anymore. The youth revolution has turned sour. They're disinterested in Vietnam. They're disinterested in the draft lottery. Students are relaxing. Their sorrows are deep. And we'll take some of the sentences of this article. The conclusion was that they have survived a lot of crises like war and assassinations and riots and demonstrations. And now they're settling down for individual interests and pleasures, and the spread of marijuana is helping them settle down. And you have lost your ego. You have your marijuana. Take it easy, kids. The fight is over. This is like the burial of the hippie at Haight-Ashbury. They buried it too soon because it isn't over. The hippie's alive, and so are the youth. And like Tinkerbell was alive in Peter Pan, we're just going to have to do a lot of clapping to keep it going. They're trying to bury you, but don't let them, please. Talking about marijuana, Louis Tackwood in Los Angeles, the policeman for 10 years who turned informer, mentioned that he charged the Los Angeles Police Department had allowed narcotics to be sold in black and Chicano communities to create a dependency on the drug and to undercut political movement. And I know that your campuses here are filled with drugs. MPC is filled with opium right now and cocaine and heavy drugs. Not so much the psychedelic things to turn you away from anything that is happening. The students out there in Carmel got excited about the artichoke farm and saving the Adela farm. This is another local thing where they generate enthusiasm. The high school people work very hard on that. But I think the college people and above are walking artichokes. I think we should turn on to those people and say, you have been turned into an artichoke. Their heads are gone. And most of them are spaced out on drugs, and the campuses all over the country are completely freaked out on drugs, and the evidence is coming in that the agencies are supplying it. And this can be documented, and I know the CIA is bringing drugs and opium in from Asia, and Iran is growing it again, our great ally Iran and Turkey. And I think there's a positive intention to flood the campuses. There's no arrest being made, and they're going to flood the campuses. You can get opium at MPC today if you want it and not be arrested. It's available to anybody who wants it. I understand that that campus is almost as heavily drugged as any campus in the United States. The student was over who helps me do filing my articles. I met through the station, and she went to Antioch and a year and a half, and she said she dropped out of there because it was so heavily doped you couldn't relate the students to anything that was going on. And she asked, the man who ran the university, why is this happening? And every university is losing its fight and fire because there is an intention to dope these students and make them very quiet. Now, this article in the New York Times says, in quotes, the great youth trip, that heady, sometimes breathtaking, frightening roller coaster ride that went through the late years of the 60s and plunged headlong into this decade is almost slowing down and may be almost over. 2 or 3 years ago, the administration of Stanford University called in a group of students and said, who are your heroes? Who do you really admire? End quote. This is interesting because whenever I talk to people, any people, I say, who are your heroes? Who do you admire? And people today don't have heroes. And I may take time out from the article, suggest a few heroes. The police informer, Louis Tackwood, I think he should be a hero. The one in Los Angeles who for 10 years helped commit crimes and plant false evidence on people and help do very bad not information on Berkeley City Council. It was none of the business of the Los Angeles Police Department. Quit the Los Angeles Police Department because it was to plant bombs in San Diego at the time of the 72 election and blow up the people who would plant the bombs and kill well-known congressmen and news people. He's a hero. He has saved a lot of lives by saying, no, I won't do it. I won't go into that. He charged the Los Angeles Police Department of planning disturbances at the National Convention in San Diego, and the disturbances would give the president a good issue for the campaign and provide an excuse for rounding up known militants across the country. He resigned after 10 years and risked his life and is in hiding. He should be a hero. If you want to know who your heroes are and you think life is hopeless, you young people, read your San Francisco Chronicle this week. A young sheriff named Richard Hungisto was just elected last Tuesday, and he's going to collect information on the police department. He says the San Francisco Police Department kills too many people. They have guns on their hips, and they use their deadly force, and they have a bad habit of letting their men shoot their people. Mr. Hongisto said this week that he's going to make improvements to save the taxpayers' money in the Criminal Justice Department, and he's going to listen to complaints against other departments, including the police. And he said, I will have a staff with a lot of experience with law enforcement, and they will provide information on police, on the work of the law. And when we see problems, we are going to be obliged to inform the public. This is a young man who ran for election and beat all the other people running, who offered 1/3 of his salary to put back to the poor part of town if he won, to listen to their problems. What Mr. Hangista said, the judges don't like the ideas that I'm going to say, and that's too bad. I'm not going to sit by idly while the taxpayers' money is being wasted on unused courtrooms. It's time to fill those courtrooms. He said, I'm going to work to ease the mutual feeling of hostility and fear and tension that exists between the jailers and the inmates. And I'm going to do away with acts of excessive force by inmates or deputies. It will not be tolerated. And he will bring the jails up to minimum standards of sanitation and health and diet. And we're going to begin treating people with dignity and cut down recidivism. Now, Sheriff-elect Richard Hongisto is not out on opium or hash or any other thing. He has listed the problems in his society. He has recruited people behind him who believe in him. He ran for office, and he won. Now, there aren't many sheriffs like that in the United States, but they could be in every city in 2 years, every election, if the young people would not believe what the New York Times is telling you or the local newspaper, that your heroes are gone. Your heroes are walking the streets. Another hero this week is Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Hebert. He was accused of telling his superiors about atrocities in Vietnam. The Army has been hassling him since he got home. And this is what Mr. Hebert said. Herbert. The Army has dropped charges against Mr. Herbert, who is America's most decorated soldier in Korea. Mr. Herbert said the following, quote, on the field of battle, as an enlisted man as an officer, I have served to the best of my ability. And in that service I have been shot 5 times and bayoneted 3 times, and none of which was as painful for me as the decision I announced. For 2.5 years I have struggled to help the Army eliminate the stigma of concealment of war crimes, which I personally saw and had the knowledge of, and the actions taken by certain members of the Army at the local and Pentagon level convinced me that to continue seeking correction within the military would be useless. End quote. He is our most decorated hero of Korea. He has served in Vietnam. He cannot work within the system. So when I speak to you about cover-ups, political assassinations, murder of candidates, we can unsolve these murders outside of their system, but in our own system. We can create our own system, like the sheriff in San Francisco or Mr. Herbert or other. He'll be Mr. Herbert. He won't be Lieutenant Colonel. There is a generative force of people to want to live and do good, and I want to rally the people, Gloria, to see that there are heroes today. Don't believe your heroes.
Ellsberg is another hero.
Ellsberg is right. I was going to read a quotation, June 25th, 1971, when Ellsberg spoke about why he released the Pentagon Papers. He said, there's never been a year when there would have been a war in Indochina without American money fueling it. If we had not been supplying the money and the napalm, nothing would have gone on that looked like a war. Americans bear major responsibility. As I read this history of every death in Indochina in the last 25 years, and that's 1 to 2 million people. Ellsberg was asked in reading the history if he found any heroes among his protagonists. In quotes, I think of the man named Bernard who put down his rifle on the ground at the risk of his life and refused orders to fire at civilians at My Lai. He's a hero, but it's hard to find men who've lived up to their responsibilities of their office in terms not only what they did, but what they could have done and what they should have done, given their feelings. End quote. Signed, Daniel Ellsberg. So, you see, I've mentioned heroes today. Louis Tackwood in Los Angeles, saving lives. He's done wrong. He's seen the light. Mr. Hungis in San Francisco, Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Herbert, Daniel Ellsberg. Don't be put down that there are not heroes.
I nominate Mae Brussell also.
Thank you, Gloria. I'm in the fire line. I'm in the battle. It has to be done, and it's something you do because you feel it's important. And there's unsung heroes. There's a silent majority that Nixon talks about. I think the silent majority are the decent people who will rally behind what's really happening and bring out the basic goodness. I never accepted the doctrine of original sin. My church-going listeners may object to my saying this. This isn't a religious program. There's original goodness, and it's in the news every week. I bring you things of gloom. I'm bringing you the heroes because I resent this article. If I don't have time to read the whole article, I will begin with the fact that they put you down. You have no heroes. I'm reading you 5 heroes in this week's news since we met last week. The last one I want to talk is a suit by the Civil Liberties Union that a landmark case on the computer's invasion of privacy where 2 women who work in the State Department of Social Welfare refused to disclose confidential information about welfare recipients to be included into computer data bank. It's a landmark case. These 2 women, their names aren't in the paper. Oh, yes, they are. Josephine Belmont and Glenda Pawsey. 2 women back east refused to pass over information for a data bank, and the Civil Liberties Union is taking care of it. It's in Pennsylvania. The Civil Liberties Union that takes its time and energy with no money to fight a cause, to defend these women. They keep their job. They were working for welfare people, and they refused to turn over this information, that it's an invasion of privacy, and they are winning this case. Those are your heroines, Josephine Belmont and Glenda Pawsey. They say it's none of your business to put it into a data bank. That is a hero. Another hero is the Supreme Court this week that upheld the right of inmates in the jails to have their own law books. The court ruled in Washington that prison officials may not limit inmates' access to law books. That happened this week. That is a fair law. I don't say the system is all bad. Now get the law books to the inmates. Donate some of your money. You may have jailhouse lawyers, and they have the right to know what the law books say. In California, it was a very important case because we were trying to keep these prisoners from having law books. Brilliant men like Rochelle McGee that are given the IQ test of being somewhat close to an idiot. The man who gave the test just must be lower. You can imagine what his IQ is because Rochelle McGee is a very brilliant, capable young person. But this is a landmark case. Again, they may defend themselves, and convicts can read their law books just as good as any lawyer who went to law school. They have the same intellect and the same capacity to understand a law book as a person in a law profession, and they have the right to read that law book. So when you're talking about heroes,
yeah,
you see how much has happened this week. Just this week. I'm cross-filing some of my articles now and cutting out what's important in the news each week. And if I have to put it under filing sections, I'm putting it under other envelopes and not losing the articles because things are coming in so fast now. Well, back to this article as much as we have time.
We have about 5 minutes.
Okay. The article goes to say that the students are going changes because they say the war in Vietnam is less visible. We don't have time to refute that statement. The war in Vietnam escalated this week. There were more bombings, heavier bombings, more money allocated to defense, more weapons ordered, more overcharge of weapons. The war is far from over. They say the draft lottery is accepted by the students because it's more equitable. People weren't objecting that the draft was unfair, not the students, because the students were getting draft deferments. Maybe the poor people were saying the draft was unfair. They were objecting to the unfairness of the war. The article is perverting the whole reason for the draft lottery argument. They said the draft is unfair because the war is wrong. They didn't want the war. The students don't want fairness and draft system. They just don't want the war for anybody. Then they say the young are changing their attitudes because the 18-year-old vote is a reality. The reality is that they're going to choose between Bomber Jackson and Richard Nixon. That is no reality, and the students better wake up to the fact that this is a put-on. This is a joke. We've talked about Henry Jackson before, that he is the man Richard Nixon wanted for the Secretary of War, but he was so far right that there may be controversy, so he chose Laird. Now, Bomber Jackson is trying to pass himself off as a liberal, and we don't have time. I cut out an article about him this week on how he would run his campaign, that the war was the last issue. The escalation of the war and the arms is so big that he calls it the last. The article says that changes are taking place with the young people, that their solutions have generally narrowed down to what they can do as individuals at a local level. I have to tell you students who didn't read the article that there's thinking that you're caring, like the MCHIP thing, your shore out here or your artichoke field. You better just say to them back in Washington that the local level isn't quite good enough for you, that while you save your green belt, you save your skin, that the national level is very much your concern, and the candidates they select for you are very much your concern, and don't believe that they're going to keep you at some local level. You can work at the local level and get your sheriffs like in San Francisco, but you better know your national level, and I'll tell it to you each week until time runs out. Now they say that radicalism isn't existing anymore. It's not paraded in the streets. That is a fact. It should never have been paraded in the streets. When the people in the Tsarist Russia wanted to overthrow an unfair regime, they didn't have meetings at Madison Square Garden and tell the Tsar what they were going to do. If this government has been overthrown, which it was, the only way you're going to gain it back is to gather information and listen to shows like this and take tapes, which many people are doing, and don't invite me over. You play tapes for your friends and send them across the states, which you are doing, and send them to Rhode Island and Florida and Texas and Michigan, where people are sending these tapes, and let them call in their own friends and have their own discussion groups and get this going at a small level with no leader. The cult thing is over, and you work at your own level and listen to these things and begin to move, because when it becomes big, your leaders are taken away. I can't take you to Madison Square Garden and talk about this. You have to take it yourself. Right. You have to talk about it at home. So the radical days on the street are over. The article says that youths are becoming tolerant. This is the way they describe you: patient, tolerant, cynical, skeptical, apathetic, and subdued. All of this is true. You're patient with anything. You're tolerant of misinformation. You're cynical about people who offer you truth. You're skeptical that anything can be done. You're apathetic because you're drugged and uninformed, and you're subdued because you're uninformed and apathetic and skeptical and cynical and overdrugged. And you just better put down your weeds and grass and put away some of the recreations until you have this country back where it's safe, because you'll belong to the slave state and you will be kept where they want you if you become a victim of the medicine they're pouring into your systems. The adults, too, they are drugged. They have a television lobotomy, I call it. Their brain was removed by CBS.
Right.
Did you have something to say?
No, I think we've got to wrap it up, though, really quick.
Okay. I think that the San Jose Mercury, November the 8th, 1971, if you copy that article on youth's great ego trip fading and outline it and analyze what they're saying, you may rally to see how hard they are trying to put down what's left of any young spirit today. And then you'll see how America's put down, too, and how America has to come back alive.
Thank you, Mae.
You've been listening to Dialogue. Dialogue is a presentation of the Public Affairs and Special Events Department of KLRB News.